This week on London Real, we have Amanda Feilding, founder and director of the Beckley Foundation for Drug Policy Reform.
It's time to change. The war on drugs has failed. This area has been taboo, no entry. It increases association, which is what creativity is, putting new concepts together. Society is a projection of the brain, and the ego projected is the government, which wants to keep in control, like the ego does.
Blame it all on marijuana.
You know, to have more sensation, more perception of music, better perception of beauty, they're all potential benefits, so it shouldn't be despised.
London Real presents Amanda Feilding, Drug Policy Reform.
Whatever the government tells you, do the opposite.
London Real set design by Timothy Olton. I'm very excited today to have the opportunity to sit down with a woman who's really been at the forefront when it comes to psychedelic research, and that is Amanda Feilding, who is the founder of the Beckley Foundation. And this is the woman that's behind a lot of the studies that are coming from Professor David Nutt, a lot of the effects of psilocybin on the brain, and MDMA and cannabis, and a lot of drug policy reform. And you know, I don't think she's ever really sat down and had an intimate conversation like this, and I was just so fortunate. She's a fascinating woman who has been there and done that. She has pretty much spent time with all of the icons throughout the years of the psychedelic movement, and now she works tirelessly behind the scenes. The accolades, I could go on and on, but you can find out more about her at the Beckley Foundation, and we're going to go through all of it here. And it was the first time that we sat down and debuted the beautiful new look we have at London Real Studios. You're now going to be introduced to Winston, the English bulldog, and the chairs and everything that's been set up here for the studios. And I really hope you like the new look. It's bringing in a whole different caliber of interviews and episodes. And what I'm finding is that people are getting a little more introspective and thinking a bit more about what's happening. And they seem to be opening up a little bit more with me as well. So super excited about what happens here going out and going forward. So I hope you enjoy Amanda. It's just, when I talk to her, I feel like we're getting a piece of history that we're not always going to have access to. So it makes me feel like, you know, we're actually speaking with someone who's very special and can kind of give us an insight as to what used to happen in the past and what we can really look forward to in the future when it comes to using things like cannabis, MDMA, psilocybin, LSD for proper medical benefits. So super excited, you know, with that. If you haven't heard, we also have a crazy thing called the London Real Academy, something I'm really excited about, and quite honestly, something I guess I've probably been working on for the past, you know, couple years in the back of my brain. And I always wanted to bring all of the London Reelers together and to get everyone to actually start making changes in their life, because sometimes I feel like people watch the show and then don't do anything. And so now we have a social network and a whole group of hundreds of people to make you accountable. We also have amazing premium London Real content like live episodes, webinars. I did my first one a couple weeks ago, and I had like 200 comments, people from all around the world logging in, pairing up with accountability buddies, setting goals. We got people losing weight. We got a woman that's going on stage for a bodybuilding competition, people running 10Ks, people finishing their PhDs, people learning Russian. And so it's all kicking off over there. We also have bonus content. We've got success secrets. So here, Amanda will talk about her success secret, but that's only available over on the London Real Academy. So log in, become part of the party, send me a friend request right away, and send me a message and tell me what you think of the site. It's something that we're constantly working on and we've worked very hard on. So super proud of that. So go check that out. And now I'm going to leave you with really the one and the only, Miss Amanda Feilding. She is just fascinating and has such a great story, and I really think we owe her a lot when it comes to the field of psychedelic research. London Real, sponsored by Bulletproof. This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Amanda Feilding, who is the founder and director of the Beckley Foundation, a UK-based think tank that has been at the forefront of global drug policy reform and scientific research into the potential medical benefits of psilocybin, MDMA, LSD, and ayahuasca. Amanda, you studied comparative religions and mysticism at Oxford and later did extensive research into altered states of consciousness, physiology, psychology, and neuroscience. The Feilding family is descended from the House of Habsburg and is intermarried with the British aristocracy, making you the Countess of Weymouth and March. Amanda, welcome to London Real.
Thank you.
You know, we've had big names in the fields of psychedelic research on this show. We've had Rick Doblin, who I know you know very well from MAPS. We've had Professor David Nutt. We've had Professor Robin Carhart-Harris. And I've had countless episodes into my own personal experiences with ayahuasca, DMT, psilocybin, MDMA. But I'm wondering what drew you into dedicating your foundation and your life into this specific type of research?
Yes, I think it's very core to human nature. And I got involved in it at a very early age, because I lived in a house which is completely isolated, surrounded by 3 moats on the edge of a bog. And so all I had to do was think about consciousness or thing. And my godfather had gone to a Ceylon and become a very famous Buddhist monk. I never met him, but he was a kind of idea. So I was always interested in Buddhism, and then I had mystical experiences, little ones, in this kind of secluded, beautiful setting. And then I wanted to study mysticism, Buddhism. I won the science prize at school. The convent wouldn't give me books on Buddhism, gave me books on art, so I left and went traveling without any money, heading for Ceylon, and never got there. So my whole life has been kind of directed towards the quest of altered states of consciousness and how we can understand them. And it's an interesting quest, and I'm still on it. And I love it. And I think it's important, because I think modern society has mistakenly shut out these states. And I think it's to the detriment of society to have done this. So exploring these altered states is not for everyone, but I think it's valuable for the society to enable those who it is for to do so, because it can bring back new ideas. I think it can propitiate creativity and healing and a different insight, which can be valuable for the individual and society. So I think at many levels it's a very important study, and it's been prohibited, well, very strongly for 50 years, but tacitly for whatever. Christianity slightly, and then the Inquisition, and then it's been kind of closing in the doors of repression on this area of experience.
Right, about as far as our own consciousness and exploring that,
yes,
has been repressed in many ways.
Absolutely.
Right.
I mean, what's his name? Said that the study of consciousness was impossible 15, 20 years ago. One who invented DNA.
Okay. Oh, was it?
Frick.
Oh, yeah, Frick. Okay. Right.
You know, he said you can't study consciousness. You can't get grants to study consciousness, not altered consciousness.
Right.
So then consciousness became okay, but altered consciousness is still too far. But actually, it's breaking open the doors of the repression in order to study it, because it's such a rich field. It's filled with new knowledge of how to treat things, how to understand consciousness, how to overcome problems, and, you know, mental, physical. I think it's a very rich area to research.
I think it was Terence McKenna that always said that, you know, what did he always say? He said, I don't know who discovered water, but it definitely wasn't a fish. And I think his point is that the best way, or one way to study consciousness is to perturb it. And,
Yes,
and like you said,
precisely.
even someone like Frick, who was obviously a highly advanced thinker, a very smart genius, but
Yeah.
it's kind of one of those intangible pieces that's hard to figure out how to study, but we know we can perturb it.
Yes, perturbing it is an incredibly valuable way. And Frick, by the way, was a keen LSD user.
Right.
But I think probably after he made his great discovery, then he turned his thought to consciousness.
You were at Oxford in the 60s, is that right?
I was at Oxford. I wasn't at Oxford. I was studying with the top, two of the top professors, one in All Souls, who was Professor Zehner, who was the kind of world expert on mysticism. And he'd written a book called Mysticism, Sacred and Profane, which was basically saying he was a Catholic convert and he had taken some LSD and not had a nice time. So the book was saying that no way is the LSD experience, this was in 50-something, similar to the mystical experience. And then, whatever, about the time I was studying with him, or no, after that, I took some LSD and I thought, it does propitiate the same potential. The mystical experience is much closer to reach.
Right, and it was still legal in the 60s,
It
right?
was legal then, yes.
Oh, right, and then was it 66 or something like that?
Around 66, I think it became.
I mean,
or 67, I forget.
You've seen, I mean, now it's weird when you fast forward 50 years and you look at, some people say currently and today that we've almost, gone forward head on into consumerism and sometimes forget our own consciousness and trying to understand it. How has the world changed since that time, in your opinion?
I mean, I think it's all a terrible mistake what's happened, because one could see it. I mean, the war on drug approach of prohibiting people to change their consciousness. One, it just doesn't work. Obviously, there's always ways around it. Two, it's very against human rights not to be allowed to experience one's own consciousness. But the most important thing is it is a disaster for human happiness. I think more than anything else in the world almost, it causes suffering at so many different levels. It's mad. It deprives, it makes people criminals, shuts them in jail. It creates illegal money, corruption, violence, war. It funds the worst type of violence. It deprives patients of treatment. It has, I could go on for 5 minutes of the disadvantages of this, and it doesn't work. That's the tragedy. We have more use of illegal drugs now, multifold, and a carefully regulated market. Of course you don't want them available at Tesco's and children just coming in and taking them. So when governments with experts need to work out what is the best way to minimize the harms at every level, and each drug has different categories of harms and potential harms and benefits, and one needs to develop one's understanding of what these are and how one tries to educate people and prevent irresponsible and dangerous use, kind of thing.
Is the war on drugs a U.S. phenomenon? Is it always something we look to the U.S. as being the ones that have to ultimately change their mind, or is it something you think we can battle in Britain, or is Britain a beachhead?
Yeah, it's definitely a U.S. thing. I mean, the U.S. speaks through the UN, so it's not directly U.S., but it is total U.S. language and prohibition, because the war on drugs enabled America to get into all the countries it couldn't otherwise get into. It was a wonderful excuse to interfere in Afghanistan, or all those countries you can get into if they grow drugs, which they all do, or transport them or do something with them. And also it's a hidden source of vast income for the CIA as well as the other side. And then it produces a lot of income for a lot of people. The prison industry is one of the biggest growing industries in America. and then there are all the police, and I mean, most of the people are very well-meaning. They're doing it because they're terrified of drugs. But that's the kind of myth which got exaggerated. And when I got into this area, I just saw what a disaster it was. And I mean, I don't like drug policy at all, but I saw what awful suffering it was causing around the world, and felt, well, I should do what I can, specifically in the areas of the substances that I know their potential value, which was cannabis and the psychedelics. You know, I knew the potential value if used well. Like in India, I know the minister of everything here, foreign affairs, he actually keeps cannabis and some opium in his study, because he said in the days in India 25 years ago when it was legal, there was no word for addiction. Now addiction's a big problem. You know, the way to control these things is to educate and contain, kind of thing.
Do you think it's an issue of language in a big way? Because when you were talking there, I kept thinking about, you know, Nancy Reagan, just say no to drugs. And I mean, we have a program here and I talk about all sorts of issues, and I'm a former banker and I have a degree from MIT, and when I talk to people about ayahuasca, sometimes they just turn off and they say, that's a drug, Brian.
Yes.
And I'm like, well, that's a language issue.
Yes, it is a language issue, I quite agree. And I think the word drug has caused almost more damage than any other word, because these substances which are termed under that umbrella are totally different substances. And to club them all together as one dangerous thing. I mean, when I started the Beckley in '98, there was no word for drug use. All drug use was misuse. And there was no evidence base. It was completely done on prejudice. It got there, prohibition, no one questioned it. You know, the whole thing was how many people do you catch, how many tons do you get hold of. It didn't relate to the reality. It didn't look at how many people lives are we ruining, how many addicts are we creating, etc. And then at a certain point I noticed that I went into kind of numbers, and actually there are tiny numbers who use the most damaging drugs, comparatively. And without the cannabis, which is 4% of the world's population, there was something like 1 point something percentage of the world's population use illegal drugs. So cannabis was never mentioned in any of the UN talks, any drug policy talk I attended and part of. Cannabis was a kind of elephant in the room which no one mentioned. So then I commissioned the leading drug policy analysts in the world. With me, we formed a commission and then wrote a book on cannabis policy and harms and how it's dealt with around the world, which had never been looked into. And that actually created, at a certain level, a realization, because these experts, by the end of the book, were saying we have to decriminalize and move towards regulation.
Each substance has its own kind of biography and history. I mean, cannabis with its prohibition in America, and you know, in the early days when it was the hemp farm issue, and now it's the federal crime. And Rick Doblin talked to me about how frustrating it is for him just to get an approved sample that he can use for study, because federally it's illegal, and they can't provide him with.
They can't get any decent cannabis.
Right.
Do you know, it's really, really incredibly low-level stuff. It's provided by NIDA, I think, and it doesn't have any CBD, which is an incredibly vital part of cannabis, which has come out of partly our research, but other research. It's an amazing substance. Well, the NIDA cannabis doesn't have CBD.
Right, even though you can go to Colorado and Washington State and other ones and probably buy the
hundreds of different varieties.
Right, over the counter now. But yet you can't get it for a federally sanctioned clinical trial.
And it's the same here. We've had, I mean, I work, Dave Nutt is my partner, and we're setting up this research, Beckley Imperial Psychedelic Research program. And we got government funding 2 years ago for a psilocybin study. Psilocybin active principle of magic mushroom.
Yes.
And it hasn't started. I mean, it's meant to be starting in a week or two because of all the regulations make it so impossible to get it. You know, you have to have a quality which is insane. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
98% is good enough. It has to be 99% or whatever.
Right.
You know.
So once you get the approval for the study, which again is not an easy thing to do.
We got the approval.
You got the
then
approval,
you get
right?
that.
Then you have to source the substance, and it has
which can be ticked in all the boxes.
Right.
I mean, psychedelics and psychoactive substances are more carefully guarded than nuclear weapons. Do you know?
I remember it was Terence McKenna that said psychedelic substances are known to cause mass hysteria in those who don't take them.
Yes.
That's what he used to say.
Yes.
And so it is again that has that alarm bell of the drugs, or of the 60s. You just mentioned Professor David Nutt, who was our guest a couple of years ago, and the incredible research he's doing at Imperial. I always look to that. I think it's more advanced than what's being done in the States, and the fascinating studies that you fund, many of those studies.
Well, actually, I don't only fund, I initiate.
Right.
And am part of the team with Dave and Robin, planning the research and how to do it, kind of thing. So it was me, because of me, we set up this program, because I had approached Dave long ago when he was at Bristol. And we started at Bristol, but he'd never done psychedelic work, so we had to start on cannabis, which we did. And then, it takes years. All
right,
these
and then years.
And then finally he moved to Imperial, and then we started the Beckley Imperial psychedelic research program.
And you started with cannabis, then you moved to the psilocybin.
Then psilocybin, because no one knows what the word means, so there's not so much taboo about it.
Isn't that strange?
Yeah.
So again, back to language.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been interested in getting to LSD, because I think it's the most interesting in many ways.
Right, and you're now getting to LSD.
Now we're on LSD.
You are on LSD
just
now.
Completed the first pilot study. Well, we've got the data, which is having to be analysed, which is very exciting. But and then you have all the problems which comes with research. So it's the first of a series of researches.
It's tireless, thankless work, isn't it?
Well, I think it's tireless, but it's very thankful, because it's exciting what you unravel. If you're interested in that game.
Yeah.
It's like football. If you're interested in football, it's very fascinating. And as you were saying, by perturbing the brain, before, the study of consciousness was dependent on wakefulness, adult wakefulness, and sleep, and psychosis. And then possibly meditation starts coming in at the door, but that was very taboo 20 years ago. But by using a psychoactive substance like a psychedelic, you perturb the brain in a very strong, or you can dose it so it's not so strong, but it's potentially a very strong way, and then you can study the changes with brain imaging, which is fantastic, although not at all accurate. I mean, it's a science at the beginning of its journey.
Right, and you use the NMRI studies, which is kind of a real-time way of looking at the brain.
Yeah.
And I might even be incorrectly, but one of the great summaries that you found, I think in one of your psilocybin studies, was actually that parts of the brain was shutting down.
Yeah.
And I think either David Nutt or Robin Carhart-Harris said it was almost like an orchestra not having a conductor.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's the ego, what used to be called the ego, which is the part of the brain was shut down. And by shut down, that means deprived of glucose and oxygen, i.e. blood supply. The blood was reduced to that part of the brain. And that, funny enough, was my original interest in this field was in 1966, when I met a Dutch scientist. And one of his major, most fascinating hypotheses was about the ego mechanism being a conditioned reflex mechanism which controls the distribution of the blood in the brain, dependent on recognition of the word. And it's a top-down system which controls from the top, the cortex, down to the subcortical areas. And funny enough, our psilocybin research showed that. It was So that was very interesting, but now the terminology is different, which is the default mode network being a part of it, which is the part, it's very fascinating, these systems in the brain, these networks.
Right, and this is an idea you were thinking about 50 years ago.
Yes, without the knowledge of exactly how the networks work, but it was the knowledge of how the self controls the circulation of the blood to control behavior and what is happening in here. And through conditioning, we learn to control, to constrict, to direct, to censor experience, to channel down, to simplify. And so that's what the whole of kind of conditioning is doing until one gets adult, when the skull seals. And then on the whole, there's a tendency to become slightly more rigid, although not for everyone. But and that's what we were studying, the ego mechanism, and describing it as the small mechanism of brain blood volume, the distribution of blood and how it's controlled in the brain,
right.
Because it needs to be controlled in order that we do all the clever things we do. If we didn't,
and survive and those kind of things,
yeah.
Right? But when you introduce psilocybin, then those pathways get blocked down a bit, and
then the controlling sensoring hubs of this default mode network, which is a lot of hubs and centers where stimulation comes in and is sorted and censored and passed on. If the functions in those centers are reduced or turned off, the sense of ego disappears. So it becomes more primal consciousness, the consciousness of a baby, of an infant, when consciousness is more part of the whole, and the kind of sense of the ego has dissolved somewhat.
Yeah.
And the fascinating thing, as you know, about our study was as people reported the loss of the ego, kind of going into the sense of eternity or whatever, one could observe parts of the brain, particularly the posterior cingulate cortex, being deprived of blood. And so it became much more anarchical, the brain. And all these different systems, networks, likewise, they slightly lost internal communication, but they gained communication with each other. So it became more chaotic, but more open. And that has kind of quite a lot of potential benefits. It's a benefit for psychotherapy if you're trying to get to a trauma and move an inflexible pattern of behavior. Normally with therapy, the person can keep the repressions in place. So it's almost impossible to, it's like water off a duck's back, it kind of goes. But with this kind of dissolving of the repressive network, it gets through, so you can reach the trauma and hopefully kind of wash it out. And it also propitiates creativity, because creativity in a sense is distant associations, connections between different parts of the brain which aren't normally connected. Suddenly you get an aha moment of oops,
right.
That. And so the loss of this censorship, which is part of what civilization has put on us. I mean, Freud is so good on the ego and the id. I mean, he was searching for this sort of knowledge kind of thing in his, particularly his early books on physiology, but never got there. And then I think Barth, who was the Dutch scientist, got a very new picture of how it might work with his picture of the ego and the control. And I think our study in psilocybin has given us an empirical look where one actually sees what Aldous Huxley expressed.
Right. Does part of you think I knew this all the time?
Yeah.
But, okay. But now we have the science to show you that I was
and that
right.
was why I set up the Beckley Foundation, was to see, to see if it's so or not, because one never knows if something's true or autosuggestion or, one's got it wrong. So, but in this case, it is very much reflecting what one expected to be the story.
You mentioned trauma, and I know we've had a soldier on the show that that suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, and I know that you're now looking into MDMA as a way of being able to confront that trauma in a way where the brain doesn't shut down when it relives it. And I believe the idea, and tell me if I'm wrong, with MDMA is the idea where you can relive that trauma and go through it and process it, whereas in the past you couldn't do that. Are you doing studies with MDMA? Is that a trickier, I hate to use the word, I'm not going to use the word drug, is that a trickier substance to work with for approval?
I think it's probably less tricky.
Okay.
Actually.
It doesn't have the phobias associated.
It doesn't have the phobias of LSD, and it's easier to take because it has a little bit of a psychedelic quality, a little bit of an amphetamine quality, and then the empathic quality. And it's perfect for psychotherapy because it makes you love yourself more, but also love the therapist, or love other people, be more compassionate, more loving, more forgiving. And our brain imaging study on MDMA showed that we got the people to write autobiographical memories of painful things and also happy things. And compared with controls, we noticed that the painful memories were less painful and the happy memories were happier. So it kind of moves the mood up. And by the empathy with the therapist and feeling more secure in yourself, you can face the trauma and wash it out and bring it into consciousness, and which is obviously the whole aim of overcoming a trauma. And also, I think this is what we're going to study now. We're going to do a study with in Cardiff with war veterans, and this will be not so much a full psychotherapeutic session. It will be slightly more just what are the acute effects of MDMA on a post-traumatic stress disorder.
Right.
And it affects the amygdala and all the parts of the brain associated with that, i.e. fear. The amygdala is hyperactive. So the smallest little bang sparks a reaction of fear, or little tiny cues bring on much stronger reactions than they should for the person's happiness kind of thing.
Do you think MDMA is going to be as important as LSD or psilocybin, say 50 years out from now, when it comes to helping people?
I think they all have their different qualities. I think it's not an either or. I think, they work on slightly different but related themes, centers, and different things can be slightly better for different problems you're trying to overcome. And it's not to say that in certain circumstances a combination wouldn't be quite beneficial, but we haven't got there. I mean, LSD and MDMA could be, because LSD is amazingly non-toxic. You can't actually kill someone with LSD. Which is amazing.
There isn't a lethal dose that we know of, is what you're saying.
No, there's not a lethal dose.
Okay.
There was a story about an elephant dying, but actually it didn't die of that. It died what the people injected it in something and it killed.
I heard that story recently. That it wasn't. And that's something that David Nutt was famous about talking about, was dosage and the lethal dose. The LD50, I think, is what it talks about. And I know he was made famous when he spoke about ecstasy and equivalency, and just comparing these, horse riding to taking ecstasy, and then when he ran the numbers, like any good scientist done, is that the horse riding is more dangerous.
And he actually did that because I'd asked him to talk at my cannabis. I gave these seminars in the House of Lords. This was to launch the cannabis report, and so he was chair of the advisory council. So I asked him to talk, and he was an old friend. So we've been working together for a long time, and he said no, it wouldn't be proper. but I'll talk about MDMA and ecstasy, and that's what got him sacked.
That's what got, and is that, so why was he sacked? And what does that say about drug policy and politics?
It says very bad news, isn't it? I mean, as he rightly says, it's kind of Galileo being, I mean, at least he wasn't sent to the guillotine, or actually it was he's being a master at turned it to his own advantage,
right,
and made the government look completely ridiculous.
Right,
You know?
And the research you two have done together since might not have happened otherwise.
I think it would have happened. It was happening anyhow. It was in the middle of our research.
Right.
But I don't think it did it any harm. I think, in fact, it elevated him to a superhero in the drug world, because he'd stood up, and not everyone does, to the truth. He wasn't saying anything. He was saying alcohol and nicotine's more dangerous than cannabis and LSD, and we know that's so. Do you know, it's scientifically so. It's not that he's saying a new fact, he was just saying what is so. And that was not permitted. And it's very frightening that even now the truth is not permitted to be spoken out loud. You have to... I've always made a point very carefully of working with governments, and I try to give them the best evidence base one can, with the best experts. But it's a fairly crazy situation that when you land in Singapore, you're told anyone with drugs can receive the death penalty. Do you know, someone might just have a bit of cannabis and I don't know. Do you know what I mean? It's a mad situation.
Do you feel a change in the last 5 years? Do you think David would have been sacked today? Is there enough?
No. There's enormous change.
There is enormous change.
2 years.
Okay.
3 years.
That's a big statement for you to make.
Enormous change.
Enormous change. Okay.
Yeah, I would say the intellectual war is won. The war to overcome the war. I mean, the battle is won in the sense.
How was that won?
I think it was a slow build-up. It was partly slowly working a way to make a hole in the dam of the taboo by providing evidence. And the Beckley was very early on. We were one of the first to start doing that, but there were other bodies doing it around the world. And so slowly the evidence started to build up. And then in 2011, I mean, whatever, I've been at it a long time by then, but one thing was that there was the Global Commission was formed for drug policy reform, which was very good because it was people the world knew. And at the same time, I did a public letter which was signed by 9 presidents and
President Columbia,
13
Sting, Yoko Ono, Richard Branson. Was this his letter?
Yeah,
and
but also Tutu and 8 presidents, President Santo, President Otto Pérez, Molina, President blah blah, I can't even remember, lots.
What was this letter all about? What was it stated in that letter?
It was just saying it's time to change. The war on drugs has failed. You know, we've run it for 50 years. It has failed in all its intentions, and it's time for us to change and look at other options. I actually can't remember, I haven't read it for 5 years, but you know, that sort of thing it said.
Statement.
It was just plain common sense. If it was a business, no business would be allowed to run at a loss of billions of dollars a year, and appalling things happening through it, wars, the spread of AIDS, I mean, so many horrible things. The young people being deprived of a livelihood because they get a prison record and no one will employ them. I mean, at every level there's horror, and all that horror in Mexico and, you know, transit countries all around the world, horror because of the drug laws. Collateral horror, devastating. And any child can get it at any street corner, easier than getting a drink because it's not licensed. So it doesn't work.
And it's not licensed and the dosage is not known.
And what they get in England, how many people smoke cannabis, I have no idea, but they get the most disgusting stuff, skunk, you know, which no one should have to smoke. You know, it's very nice to have a balance. It's a plant which has a lot of connoisseurship. It's an incredible plant which has something like 400 ingredients, 60, 18 cannabinoids, some with a high medical benefit. And the one which is really absolutely fascinating, which had been bred right out of it by the illegal market, is something called cannabidiol, which is CBD for short. And it can treat almost every known condition. I mean, it's antipsychotic, anti-anxiolytic, anti-cancerous, anti-inflammatory, you just go on and on and on. And because of the illegal market, which goes for always to make drugs stronger, because you get more money for stronger substances, less bulk, more money. So they always go stronger, opium to heroin, coca to crack.
Right.
And now, lovely old-fashioned cannabis with a mixture of CBD and terpenes and all the other things you got in it when it grew up in the Himalayas, has gone to skunk grown under lights with insecticides and high THC, no mixture. You know, so it's a tragedy that this has been allowed to happen, and we need to reverse it. And that's what's beginning to happen in America.
Right, but you said in America, I mean, the prison system is being commercialized. It seems almost as an all-time high. You know, the narco lords in Mexico, and the amount of violence is just kind of in a shocking way. We had a filmmaker on named Adam Scorgi who had a movie called The Culture High, which had Richard Branson in there and Graham Hancock and a few others, and it was just examining this whole phenomenon as it's gone full circle. Yes, in Colorado and Washington State we have the legalization, yet at the same time.
Yeah. But that's typical in a way. It's compensation, isn't it? I mean, the drug war is an American phenomenon. They created it to fill the gap which was left by the end of Prohibition, or there were all sorts of factors. And it was a way of getting and minorities, and it had a lot of factors which made it happen. But it was totally an American phenomenon which they spread with total determination. So not one of the countries dared break this conventions, which are completely unscientifically grounded. And then when poor little Bolivia tried to break it a few years ago, led by America, but the UK in quick pursuit, said no, they mustn't be allowed to chew the coca leaf. And it's madness. So I've been through the Beckley working at the UN level, and we've written a report of how you would adapt the conventions so that individual countries or groups of countries can experiment with, one, decriminalization, but secondly, with careful regulation. Because we've got no evidence-based for regulation, because no one has been allowed to do it, except in America, because America's the only country in the world which doesn't have to obey the UN regulations, because their internal regulations are above the UN, and they are the ones who made the UN regulations. I mean, it's very kind of catch-22.
It's funny, I guess you have to be a political scientist at a certain level, to try to deal with some of this, because there's so many levels of policy, and you have to kind of understand. I know, and we'll leave that to Rick and what he does. Amanda, what if there's one study you could do and you wouldn't have to worry about getting the approval or finding the substances? Is there one where you would say, Brian, I want to take 100 people and I want to do this or this or this? Do you have your bucket list study?
Yes, but it would have a lot of elements in it. In fact, I'm working towards it now. I think, for me, the two compounds I find particularly interesting are LSD and cannabis. But mind you, each one has its different characteristics. Ayahuasca has DMT, which brings about a different, and that in itself is fascinating, is seeing why do the different classic psychedelics and cannabis have their different effects? What parts of the brain are they stimulating to bring about the particular effects that they bring?
And that's a combination of those two?
Yes.
Cannabis and LSD, or cannabis and
No,
DMT?
not a cannabis, or either, but then I'd like to, there are a lot of things. I want to know more about how it works in the brain. I think it does change the blood supply. This was old hypothesis that I learned from the Dutch scientists, and I still think I haven't investigated carefully enough to have decided it's definitely not true. So I want to look at that more, and how it's distributed in the blood. I mean, at the moment, brain imaging is quite crude. I don't think it can see changes in capillary volume. That's just what I want to start doing now, looking at how one would look at changes in capillary volume. And the other, that's work I'm doing with this leading professor in Russia, who's the kind of world's leading specialist on cerebral circulation. We've been working for about 8 years, developing a non-invasive monitor to read different things. But to look how LSD propitiates meditation, I think that's a very fascinating area. And indeed cannabis. They move in the same direction. Meditation also reduces the blood supply to the default mode network, and that's why people experience unity with the all, or whatever word one wants to use.
And you said even 20 years ago meditation was taboo. That's hard for me to hear, because these
it
days
was.
it's quite
it was taboo.
right.
Yeah, yeah.
It's interesting because you've seen so many different levels evolve. I mean, you've seen LSD being legal, and then being, made illegal, and then vilified, and now kind of almost come full circle with you being able to...
Almost coming back again. That's what I promised Albert Hofmann, who made it. I promised him that I would open the doors to serious research to his problem child.